Disney is known for creating the best fantasy and adventure stories for everyone, but once in a while they come out of that shell and dare to create some terrifying stories. So today we'll take a look at 8 of the scariest Disney movies. The Black Hole. In the late 70s and early 80s, both Disney's live-action and animated films were at a low point. The company thought that this was partly because their target audience had now grown older and were looking for other, more mature content. So they decided to branch out to also appeal to the young adult market. And a slate of more mature projects were planned. The first of these was The Black Hole. You see, in the 70s, disaster movies like Airport, The Poseidon Adventure, and The Towering Inferno were a massive success. So, writers Bob Barbash and Richard Landau approached Disney Studios to make a disaster film set in space titled Space Station 1. The project went through many changes, with everything but the space setting being scrapped, and it changed from a space adventure to a horrifying space trip to hell. The story follows a group of space explorers that come upon the USS Cygnus, a ghost-like spaceship abandoned except for the mad Dr. Reinhardt and his crew of menacing androids and robots, including the demonic-looking machine, Maximilian. The unhinged Reinhardt has plans to fly the Cygnus into a black hole no matter what the price, and boy, was the film bold. Audiences expected the Black Hole to be sort of a more kid-friendly Star Wars. Instead, they got a slow-paced movie with a terrifying ending. The film contained murder, of course, mild swearing, adult themes, and of course the very creepy and weird setting, so it's no surprise that it was the first PG-rated Disney film. PG went a lot farther in those days, I guess. In one of the most disturbing scenes, Alex Durant, one of the main characters played by Anthony Perkins, is murdered by an evil robot. On the Cygnus Bridge, the robot mastermind, Maximilian, activates his blades and goes straight for the heart of Durant, who tries to block the attack with his notebook, but the blades saw right through, because it's a notebook. Shown just off screen, the audience can only imagine the implied evisceration by Perkins's pained facial reaction. This isn't the scariest scene in the movie, guys, no, don't worry. We also find out that the crew of creepy robots are actually lobotomized and basically zombified crew members who have tried to stage a mutiny. And then there's the ending where the travelers exit the hole and enter hell and then heaven. Maximilian and Reinhardt merge and stand on a high rock overlooking a burning hellish landscape surrounded by flames and legions of hooded, skeleton-like figures. After that, the camera emerges through a divine glass tunnel as angels float around. The film was a modest success, grossing about $35.8 million from a $20 million budget. Though it wasn't a big hit, Disney did not shy away from their original plan and decided to continue creating these types of movies, as we're going to see here in a little while. While The Black Hole may not be a scary movie for audiences nowadays, back then it was shocking that Disney decided to create such a creepy and weird film, and honestly, some of those scenes are uncomfortably unsettling. The Watcher in the Woods. So Disney continued creating these more mature movies for a while, but none of the movies they made during this time compared to The Watcher in the Woods. The Watcher in the Woods was Disney's first tribute to a horror film. Based on the 1976 novel by Florence Randall, this supernatural ghost story follows a family that moves into an old English manor where the teen daughter discovers a ghostly secret. This terrifying movie goes into themes like secret societies, the occult, and believe it or not, yes, aliens. You see, the house that the family moves into belongs to Mrs. Allywood, a traumatized, sallow, and melancholy woman played by none other than Bette Davis. And from the moment the family moves into the main house, a series of terrifying events occur, primarily to 17-year-old Jan. She begins to feel this strange presence and is haunted by images of a young blonde girl with a blindfold. We find out that the young girl in the blindfold is actually Mrs. Allywood's teenage daughter Karen, who disappeared 30 years earlier during a solar eclipse. It was this whole thing. Long story short, she and 3 of her friends were holding a kind of seance in a church and things got wacky. This movie is full of creepy and even scary scenes, from the little sister being possessed multiple times, the creature's weird point of view scenes, and the many times the blindfolded girl haunts Jan. The creepy tone of the movie is continually being set. One of the most terrifying moments in the movie comes fairly early when Jen falls into a pond and gets stuck, and Mrs. Allywood begins shoving her with a giant branch. It looks as if Mrs. Allywood is trying to ensure that Jan drowns, once, but we soon find out that she's actually trying to pry Jan loose and save her. Still, the visual of seeing the young, wide-eyed heroine underwater, struggling to live, scared out of her mind, while a haggard old woman stands over her, is very unsettling.
The Watcher in the Woods, from Walt Disney Productions. It is not a fairy tale.
The movie was meant to be horror from the very beginning. When producer Tom Leach pitched the idea to Ron Miller, he said that this movie could be Disney's Exorcist. The only problem was that while the movie was written to be a horror movie, and even had John Hugh, famed horror movie director, attached to the project, Disney decided that the original version was too dark and threatening, so they hired another screenwriter to lighten the mood, and the result is a very messy mix of horror tropes. But this is not the only problem it had. You see, the eerie atmosphere of the movie was preparing the audience for an apparently supernatural ending. This ending did not come though, and the movie suddenly changed to a kind of sci-fi horror movie. That's right, the film's original intended ending featured an appearance by the Growling Watcher, a skeletal insectoid alien which picks up Jan in the chapel and then disappears. And the problem was that not only was the villain an alien, but that the effects were awful. When the monster showed up on screen looking like shredded trash bags hot glued to a Halloween mask, the audience began laughing. Even though the film was based on a book where the Watcher is, in fact, an alien entity from outer space, this ending didn't work, and critics were very harsh. And so a new ending was shot with fewer special effects. They decided to make the Watcher a kind of energy that would speak through Jan's sister. This was much more in keeping with the novel's version of the creature and made way more sense to viewers. But even with all those problems, The Watcher in the Woods is a very creepy movie and worth a watch, especially during Halloween time. Something wicked this way comes. Ray Bradbury was a longtime Disney collaborator, and one of the times he worked closely with Disney was in the 80s when they got together to bring Ray Bradbury's novel, Something Wicked This Way Comes, to the big screen. Bradbury adapted his own book, something he'd been working on getting made for several years, and was directed by Jack Clayton, a British filmmaker who directed one of the greatest ghost movies ever, 1961's The Innocents. The film follows the story of a pair of small-town young boys who discover that the carnival that has come to town is being led by a devilish, otherworldly ghoul named Mr. Dark, pretty on the nose if you ask me, who has come for the souls of the town people. The carnival is a freaky fair full of rides and games, but its main features are a house of mirrors that show people what they want to see and a carousel closed to the public. Mr. Dark uses this carousel to make the townspeople's dreams come true, but of course, with a price. The film may not be as dark and layered as Bradbury's novel, but with Bradbury writing the script, it's still able to incorporate many creepy and disturbing elements. When the film was done and Clayton turned in his director's cut, which Bradbury himself was happy with, Disney found test audiences thought it was too grim and scary. Disney spent about $5 million reshooting various sequences and adding in an action scene where tarantulas attack the boys in their rooms and a final showdown in the mirror maze. They also added extra narration to explain the story and changed the original score because it was considered too scary. You would think that this made the film ultimately family-friendly with no creepy elements, but that couldn't be further from the truth. For starters, the tarantula scene that was added is completely nightmare-inducing, if tarantulas give you nightmares. The scene where Mr. Dark is defeated on and by his own carousel is also terrifying. We see him aging rapidly while being electrocuted in a very Emperor Palpatine-like fashion. And what makes this scene even crazier is that it goes on for full minutes, intercut with the rest of the action all the time. But if you think this is the worst scene in this movie, you might be wrong. There's one where Will, one of the main characters, has a vision where he sees himself getting beheaded by a guillotine. That's right, Will sees his own head chopped off and rolled into a basket, and there's blood and viscera around the neck and everything. Pretty gruesome. With the autumn backdrop and a small town setting, the film is a perfect Halloween story. Return to Oz. Walt Disney had always wanted to turn L. Frank Baum's Oz books into movies, but MGM beat him to the punch. So as soon as The Wizard of Oz came out, he snapped up all the rights to all of the other Oz books for potential use on his Disneyland TV show. This, of course, never happened, but years later, Walter Murch met with the studio and told them he was interested in developing a new Oz story, which Disney leaped at because their copyright was about to expire. And that is how Return to Oz came to life. Return to Oz is a great movie, but it's not what you might expect for a sequel to the original Wizard of Oz. You may think it's a wonderful journey back to the amazing rainbow-filled land of Oz, but this land, in this movie, is way more terrifying. The plot for this movie is loosely based on L. Frank Baum's second and third novels, and to give you an idea of how dark the film is, the beginning of the film takes us back to Kansas where Dorothy, thought to have psychological problems because of her tale of Oz, is sent to an asylum for a round of electroshock therapy to cure her. That's right, electroshock therapy. This is one of the darkest and creepiest scenes in the movie. Seeing Dorothy completely scared and strapped into a machine that is about to send shockwaves through her brain is absolutely unsettling. Thankfully, a storm intervenes before the lever is even pulled, but the scene is built on the unbearable tension, of course. Dorothy manages to escape and ends up in Oz again. Her happiness in returning to Oz soon dissolves into horror as she finds the magical land in ruins and the Emerald City a wasteland. The kingdom is now ruled by the Gnome King and the wicked Princess Mombi, who captures Dorothy, but she escapes with the aid of new friends, Tik-Tok, Billina, a talking hen, Jack Pumpkinhead, and the Gump. From the Gnome King's rock guards to the creepy citizens of the Emerald City that have turned into stone, Dorothy encounters all types of frightening creatures. The first of these encounters is one that Dorothy has with the Wheelers. Now, the Wheelers are creepy-looking psychotic creatures with wheels instead of hands and feet. The faces on the helmets are horrible, and their feral barking and menacing laughter are almost worse. Almost. Watching them terrorize Dorothy is unsettling, but nothing compares to the scene where Dorothy goes to Princess Mombi's castle. See, Princess Mombi is a headless witch who commands a corridor of severed heads who are all alive and looking around. When she meets Dorothy, she tells her that she wants her head and that she'll lock her up until her head is fully grown and ready. Then she'll take it and add it to her collection. If you don't think this is creepy enough, what happens next will surprise you. See, add a little bit of intrigue, let it sit for a second. Okay, Dorothy manages to escape and has to break into Mombi's room to get the Powder of Life, which is in a cabinet with Mombi's original head. So she tiptoes into Mombi's head chamber while she and her heads are asleep. Dorothy finds the powder, but she accidentally wakes up the original head, who begins screaming. This wakes up the rest of the heads in Mombi's collection, and they all start screaming too, so now it's just a giant choral cacophony of screaming bodiless heads. Suddenly, Mombi's headless body awakens also and begins to reach out for Dorothy to stop her. This scene is nightmare-inducing. This movie might not take us back to the beautiful land of Oz, but it's a cult classic that you should definitely check out for yourself. The Scarecrow of Romney Marsh. Before having Iron Man and Captain America in its ranks, Disney had one of the most fearful Avengers that ever existed, and ironically one of the creepiest. We're talking about the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, a phantom vindicator that rode out of the pages of British literature in the tale of an 18th century night-riding smuggler who was actually on the side of justice. The year was 1954, and Walt Disney was proudly presenting what would become one of the most favorite productions he ever made. The Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, on the other hand, was one of the strangest and most fascinating Disney productions ever to gallop across the screen. It was a 3-episode installment of the Wonderful World of Disney weekly television show that was later released as a theatrical feature film. This show told the adventures of the heroic and demonic Mr. Sin, a real-life Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. By day, he was a respected member of his community, and by night, he was the greatest smuggler in the whole country. But like Robin Hood, even though he was a thorn in the side of law and order, he was a hero to ordinary folk, because whatever he made as a smuggler, he gave away to the poor and needy. The difference between the two is that this seemingly creepy crusader was made a fearful figure, conceived to horrify the corrupt officials he battles.
You're dead! Run for your life!
The Scarecrow did not work alone, though. He had 2 sidekicks. The demonically disguised Curlew, in reality John Banks, son of the local squire, and Hellspite, Dr. Sin's sexton, Mr. Mipps, wearing a skull mask, and of course they were determined to thwart the soldiers of the unjust king. The Scarecrow's mask and costume and his trademark blood-curdling laugh give this series-turned-film the perfect spooky ambiance for Halloween. It is beloved by many generations, and a must-watch during the Halloween season. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's impossible to make a list about Disney's scariest movies without mentioning The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Back in 1945, Disney released The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This film has 2 segments. The first is The Wind in the Willows, based, of course, on the 1908 novel of the same name by Kenneth Grahame. The second segment is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, based on the 1820 Washington Irving classic short story. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is one of the best films ever created by Disney. The beautiful animation, perfect pacing, narration, character design, and haunting musical numbers are excellent. And the atmosphere it creates is incredibly spooky. And not only that, but it's one of the most accurate versions of the tale ever put to film. The film centers around the story of Ichabod Crane, a schoolteacher who just arrived at Sleepy Hollow, Brom Bones, his one-sided rival, and Katrina Van Tassel, the most beautiful girl in town. As soon as Ichabod arrives, he quickly proves to be a ladies' man who charms Katrina, much to Brom's displeasure. A subtle rivalry erupts, but Ichabod constantly gains the upper hand until Brom learns of Ichabod's superstitious personality on Halloween night of all nights. Brom takes advantage of this and tells the legend of the fearsome Headless Horseman in one of the most haunting and amazing musical numbers Disney has ever created, sung by Bing Crosby. This works, and Ichabod ends up completely terrified. This is when the film turns from a cute story to a chilling horror tale. Ichabod leaves the party, and his ride home is exceedingly frightening. He rides terrified of encountering the Headless Horseman. The fearful atmosphere continues increasing until a false alarm breaks the tension. You would think Ichabod is safe, but suddenly the horseman appears, when the dark headless figure finally arrives on his horse holding a flaming jack-o'-lantern and laughing maniacally. Ichabod, and anyone who is watching, feels real terror. This, along with the fantastic Night on Bald Mountain in Fantasia, is probably the most terrifying scene in any Disney movie. The horseman's design is astounding, and the spectacular chase scene is creepy, and a little bit impressive. Plus, the flaming projectile pumpkin is so striking and memorable that it was referenced in Tim Burton's 1999 R-rated Sleepy Hollow. The movie was such a Halloween icon that it became a very important part of Disney Parks' Halloween celebrations, and it is fantastic to see the Headless Horseman riding through the parks, guided by Ichabod Crane. The Black Cauldron. Speaking of scary animated movies, we need to talk about The Black Cauldron. The Black Cauldron was Disney's 25th animated movie and the first to be rated PG. And with good reason, because this film is one of the darkest things ever created by Disney and released as a Disney title. Disney ditched the songs and lighthearted feel that marked its animated features up to that point in favor of a darker fantasy epic. The Black Cauldron was meant to return the company's animation unit to its former glory, mostly by employing several flashy gimmicks that they thought would get people excited. That, spoiler alert, didn't, like filming it in 70mm film and having many computer-generated flourishes. Sadly, the movie ended up being a flop, and in part this happened because the new studio head, Jeffrey Katzenberg, ordered a number of edits long after such a thing was possible. More than 12 minutes were ultimately removed, and this made the film feel a bit choppy. But that does not mean that it's not terrifying. Set during the Dark Ages, the film centers on a young boy, Taran, who, along with a group of brave friends, tries to stop the evil Horned King from obtaining a powerful cauldron that will give him world domination. The Horned King is probably the most terrifying and nightmare-inducing Disney villain to have ever existed. The Horned King is a skeletal creature with green, rotting flesh and two gnarled horns from which he earns his name. But if you think that this villain is the scariest part of the movie, you're wrong. From the chilling introduction where the narrator warns viewers about the power of the cauldron that could summon an army of deathless warriors to some, pretty creepy witches, the movie is full of frightening scenes. But of course, the climax of the film had to be the most terrifying part of all. After the Horned King gets the cauldron, he summons the army of deathless warriors, and in order to save everyone, Gurgi, one of the main characters, frees the prisoners and flings himself into the cauldron to negate its necromancy ability. No, we're not playing D&D, this happens in a Disney movie. This works, and the army begins to die again. The Horned King is furious and goes back to the cauldron to see why this is happening. He grabs Taran, but Taran manages to push the Horned King into the cauldron. The very thing that the Horned King hoped would give him the power to take over the world with an undead army instead melts his flesh off. It's a bit more gruesome than the average falling deaths most Disney villains get. While it is very dark and might not feel like a Disney movie, The Black Cauldron is fantastic, and even was featured in one of the coolest defunct Disney park attractions, Tokyo Disney's Cinderella Castle Mystery Tour, which was a walkthrough attraction where one of Disney's scariest animatronics, the Horned King, made an appearance. Mr. Boogedy. With the arrival of Disney Plus, many strange gems and movies emerged from the Disney vault. One of these was Mr. Boogedy. In its beginnings, Mr. Boogedy was supposed to be produced by Columbia Pictures as a feature film starring Cheech and Chong called Cheap Tricks. It was going to be a sort of parody on horror movies like Scary Movie, or Scary Movie 2, or Scary Movie 3. The script was practically a copy of what Mr. Boogedy ended up being, but much riskier. But a Columbia executive was extremely offended when he read a scene where The Exorcist was parodied and asked for the film to be canceled. The film's director, Oz Scott, received a call from Disney to produce the film in a much more family-friendly way. And of course, that's how Mr. Boogedy was created. The made-for-TV movie aired on ABC on April 20th, 1986, and follows a family of practical jokers who move to a creepy, run-down house in Lucifer Falls. When weird things things begin happening, like missing teddy bears and slimy green footprints climbing the walls, a creepy old man named Mr. Witherspoon tells the kids that the house is haunted by Mr. Boogedy, a crusty old pilgrim who made a deal with the devil. And even though Mr. Boogedy doesn't appear much in the movie, and despite the fact that the film is more silly than horror, the scenes with Mr. Boogedy can be quite frightening because of the character's design. Some people have compared Mr. Boogedy to a rotting Emperor Palpatine, which says a lot about the design, to be honest. The film was rumored to be a pilot for a discarded series, but who knows if that's true. In the end, this film was loved by many people, and because of this, a sequel was produced. The Bride of Boogedy was released, but sadly not with the original cast. Both of these films have created a cult following over the years, so much so that when it was announced that Mr. Boogedy was coming to Disney Plus, fans created the Boogedy Challenge on Twitter. What does this challenge entail, you ask me, and I'm glad you did. No, it's not go out into a graveyard in the middle of the night and watch the movie. No, instead it was just watch Mr. Boogedy first when Disney Plus launched. Although that sounds like something really fun to do on Halloween night. This was in order to have the algorithm recommend the movie to other viewers, and we don't know if it worked, but it might have because The Bride of Boogedy was added to Disney Plus a little bit later. These films might not be super scary, and me, having ridden the Haunted Mansion time and time again, I'm hardly scared by anything. But they're a great introduction to the genre for kids, and a great choice if you're looking to do a Disney Halloween movie marathon. And I know I am.